Okay, fantastic. Um, can you all hear me? Yeah, thumbs up.
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
so we are live. We are ready to go. I'll get started. Thank you all so much for joining us today. My name is Shahid Rahman. On behalf of the American Muslim Institution, welcome and Assalamu alaikum. Peace and blessings be on all of you. I think it seems like we're living amidst interesting and historic times today. And oftentimes, as far as history is concerned, and I'm speaking as a history teacher, former history teacher, usually at a later point in the future, people say, wow, that point in history was a pivotal point, was a crucial moment. But I think today, we're actually in the midst of history being made. And I think the significance of today is that people recognize that we are in this historic moment. We're living through COVID-19, and now Racism 2020 is trending on Twitter. It's a very different time that we could have imagined only 6 months ago. It's a challenging time, and sometimes people are not sure how to feel, whether it's to be angry, to be sad, to be frustrated, or even to be hopeful. A lot of what I'm seeing today gives me a tremendous hope. So personally, I'm quite conflicted with how I should feel and how I feel seeing everything all around us. And I think to help me work out some of these emotions and really to better understand what is going on and what we're going through as a people, I thought it would be nice to turn to some different experiences and by listening to some of our friends and partners from different faith traditions. And today we are very fortunate to have an all-star lineup of mentors and teachers, and I am so excited to learn from and hear from. There will be Q&A for those of you interested in asking some questions. You can either send us a message on Facebook Live at American Muslim Institution. We'll be monitoring that, or you can put it into the chat or Q&A section on the Zoom toolbar. But to begin with, I'm so excited to introduce all of our esteemed panelists. Again, I feel like I'm the luckiest person today getting to moderate this wonderful conversation about such a topical issue that's impacting not only the African American community, but I think communities of faith. And as a Muslim, I'm looking at this from that point of view, from that lens. What can I do as a Muslim? What should I be doing as a Muslim? So to begin the program, I'll have the opportunity to introduce all of our esteemed guests, and then I'll open it up to some discussion. So to start, the first person we have with us today is the Reverend Dr. Faith B. Harris. She is a professor at the Samuel D. Witt Proctor School of Theology and Virginia Union University and director of the Endowment Center for Faith, Leadership, and Public Life. Reverend Dr. Harris is a theoethnicist, grassroots organizer, and faith leader whose service is a model for womanist and practical theology methodology. She is actively involved in the life of the church and local community as well as public sphere. She is committed to the creative integration of faithful scholarship and community service. I think that's what we need today, to be able to apply what we know in our societies. Dr. Harris takes every opportunity to model an ethic of public leadership and service seminars while making available the tools needed for them to achieve broader and deeper faith while insisting upon the church's continued relevance in public sphere. Thank you. Next, we have Pastor Willie J. Barber II, my friend Bo. Pastor Bo is a senior pastor at Prospect AME Church in Fortston, North Columbus, Georgia. He's also the census liaison for the 6th Episcopal District of the African Methodist Episcopal Church for directing and implementing community engagement for social activism for over 525 AME churches in the state of Georgia and 2020 Georgia statewide faith-based complete count committee. Prior to early retirement, Pastor Barber held positions at the director level for three separate global engineering companies for 30 years, managing assets of over 14 million annually. A Georgia native, Pastor Barber is a graduate of LeGrand College and continued graduate studies at the University of Georgia and Emory University. And last but certainly not least, Imam Zaid Shakir is a scholar and co-founder of Zaytuna College in Berkeley, California. The Imam was born in Berkeley and accepted Islam in 1977 while serving in the US Air Force. He obtained a BA with honors in international relations at American University in Washington, D.C., and later earned his MA in political science. After a year in Cairo studying Arabic, he settled in New Haven, Connecticut, and founded Masjid al-Islam in 1988. After studying Arabic, Islamic law, Quranic studies, and Islamic spirituality for 7 years with some of our top Muslim scholars of our age, he returned to Connecticut in 2001. He has been annually ranked in the top 500 most influential Muslims of our time. I don't think I have done justice to all of our panelists, but I have done my best. But I want to get the conversation started immediately. You know, we have seen in the news over the last couple of weeks the brutal death of Ahmaud Arbery and then later on George Floyd. And there has been such an outcry, but historically, there have been these types of cases again and again throughout the history of the United States. And I'd love to understand from, maybe we can start with Reverend Dr. Faith Harris, what has changed today? Dr. Harris.
Thank you. Thank you for that lovely introduction as well. I think in some ways, nothing has changed. And then in other ways, everything has changed. You're right in noting that this has happened decade after decade. We had certainly decades where lynching was, commonplace, and where people of African American descent knew that they could not freely move about the country without taking their lives in their hands. But I think what has changed is the reality for many of us that it hasn't gone away, that it hasn't changed enough, that enough has not changed, that the root of the problem is still there, and it's still producing, and it's still feeding the tree that has been the, in many ways, metaphor tree as a lynching site for Black lives. And so, and thinking of it and as a metaphor and a symbol in many ways for white supremacy. And that really is the root of the problem. And I think that what we are recognizing is that in the midst of a pandemic, we've had the opportunity to look at it, to examine it, to analyze it with more detail, as not just we who are African American and who experience this all the time, but the entire world, the globe. People around the globe are watching and paying attention and are able to think about this in more clear ways. And so I think it's been the pandemic that has made the difference. And then I also think that it's been building more intensely. The tension has been there over the last 10 years. We could say it being much more prominent, starting with Trayvon Martin. We've watched, Michael Brown in the street. We've watched Eric Gardner choked. We've watched and read about and heard the stories of Sandra Bland, and then there's been Tamir Rice, a young child playing in a park. And so we've had the privilege or the curse of phone cameras where people can take video of these horrific events and to share them immediately with with the world. And so it's been in our faces. We have had to see it. So I think it's a confluence of all of those things and more that have made it different. The climate in our right now is very tense politically. There's a great deal of rhetoric that is racially charged, as well as not just racially charged, but also um, um, in some ways caricature of white supremacy in ways that we have not seen in decades. So I think that it's a confluence of all of those things that make it different. What makes it the same is that the problem starts with the founding of this country. It starts with explorers leaving Europe in the name of their kings and of the Pope to subdue, eradicate, or enslave all those who were not, deemed Christian or would not be Christian or would not submit to Christianity. So I think there are a number of reasons why I think that it's coming to an apex or maybe to a climax where the world has to pay attention. We don't have the distractions to keep us from paying attention to these horrific events.
I think that's great. I mean, it's in your face and there's no escaping it. Like you mentioned, the curse of cameras, handheld cameras.
Yeah.
Pastor Barber, would you like to share some of your thoughts?
Sure, absolutely. And thank you again, Zaid, for being so gracious with the introductions and so forth. That was better than I deserved, for sure. But I can't help but take a moment in this time in Georgia to give a shout out to my mentor, Bishop Reginald T. Jackson, who has worked tirelessly for social justice, not only in the districts where he has served, but also nationally. Today, he, along with other faith leaders and the and members of the Congress of both houses, have successfully worked to pass a hate crime bill in Georgia. That bill is now on its way. It's on its way to the governor's desk, and it is my understanding that there is a commitment to sign it. So as we are dealing with the difficulties and the disappointments of the day and our reality, we are now finding that, yes, perseverance does pay off. Yes, due diligence does pay off. And the steady beat of a determined drum does make a difference. I think you can appreciate this as a history teacher and professor and just an advocate for history. History is a much better report card of our society than our rhetoric, because we often talk a really good game when it comes to the advancement of causes and issues around civil rights and the rights of human beings and what we do for humanity. But America is very reactionary. It is rare that we are proactive in this country to move the needle in a positive way to change the narrative of the status quo. Something always has to happen, okay? And this time, I think that with the in the moment, in the living room, if you will, in your face commentary of George Floyd, America could not find an excuse not to watch. And because of that, we were convicted even as we pondered. We had to come to the reality and admit that as much as many things have changed, but there's still a lot of things, a majority of things that have not. And I think as we move forward in this conversation, we're going to find that it's not the rhetoric that we spew, but it is what we have learned and how we apply the history of our culture in this country. And the history of our culture in this country is not always pleasant when it comes to human and or civil rights. And I think that can be applied to all faiths. And we can look at it not only nationally, but we can look at our method of thinking globally. I mean, if we look at China, if we look at India, and how Muslim communities have suffered in those arenas, and as people of faith in this country, as Protestants and Catholics and those of the Jewish faith look at, and all other faiths look at the way we have approached the problems of the day, we can all say that the common thread is that we must help individuals be able to face reality.
Thank you, Pastor Bo. Imam Zaid, love to get your take on this.
Yeah, in addition to everything that's said, so I'm agreeing with Reverend Dr. Harris, and if I may, Pastor Bo,
Yes.
What they said. I think what's different is the inexcusable nature of the way George Floyd was killed. In other words, oftentimes these things happen, there's an excuse, even if it's the flimsiest excuse. Tamir Rice had a toy gun, which even the lady who called into the police, untrained, recognized as a toy gun. When she made the call to 911, I think it's a toy gun. But the police rolled up and they saw a gun. Or there's usually an excuse. Ahmadou Diallo, even though his face was to the back of these plainclothes policemen who rolled up on him, he was reaching in his pockets to pull out his keys to unlock the door to his apartment, facing away from the police. But there was an excuse. It's a pathetic excuse. So I'm not excusing the criminal nature of these killings. But with George Floyd, 9 minutes, casually kneeling on his neck, your hand in your pocket, the demonic smirk on your face, there's no excuse. And I think what was mentioned earlier, the entire world saw there was no excuse for this man to die. And so I think that's what was different, in addition to everything else that was said. And people were forced to take a stand, like in the face of this inexcusable snuffing out of the life of a totally helpless human being, hands cuffed behind his back, face down on the pavement, 3 policemen standing on him. I have to do something. I think a lot of people came to that point of reckoning. That's in what, as Muslims, we say there's the seen world. That's the seen world. In the unseen world, I think God wanted to send a message to us. And so as Muslims, we believe everything transpiring is according to the will of God. And so God wanted to send us a message this time, and to send those in authority and those in power a message this time that he didn't choose to send in all of those previous instances mentioned by Reverend Dr. Harris of Tamir Rice and Trayvon Martin and Sean Bell and Gary King and Oscar Grant and Ayanna Jones and Sandra Bland and Alden Sterling and Eric Garner, and the list we can spend the whole program mentioning. This time God said, I'm going to send a message, and I hope that you respond in a way pleasing unto me.
Thank you, Imam Zaid. I wanted to follow up some of this discussion about what was it like, for example, the civil rights movements in the 60s. A lot of what we hear is a lot of the rhetoric around it, or at least the perception is it was couched around faith. And today we're seeing so much excitement on the streets as far as Black Lives Matter and their allies are concerned. Do you, Imam Zaid, see similarities to the 60s civil rights movement versus differences? Do you see any parallels? Love to get your take first.
Well, I think that there are differences, stark differences. One big difference is during the 60s, the overwhelming majority of those protesting were African Americans. I think that's one big difference. Another big difference is that you hadn't seen the fractures in the citadels of power that you see today. So maybe you wouldn't have seen, and his intentions left to God, you wouldn't have seen the equivalent of a Mitt Romney, a formal Republican presidential candidate, in the streets marching with the protests. In the 60s, you wouldn't have seen policemen all over the country, and these are European American policemen taking knees and joining protests. You wouldn't have seen that. A lot of similarities you still see, far too much, even though, of course, if it bleeds, it leads. I would say 99% of the protests happening throughout the cities and towns and villages of this country were nonviolent, overwhelmingly. But there was the tear gas, and there was the shameful violence that we saw in Lafayette Park before our president did his photo op holding the Bible upside down. And so I think that sort of similarity, that sort of resort to violence, that sort of using this as an opportunity to push an agenda that really doesn't honor the deceased, nor does it honor all of those who have suffered, regardless of their religion, their race, their ethnicity, at the hands of law enforcement in this country. And that's not to say all law enforcement are racist or bad, but if you consider that every year in this country, between 1,000 and 1,100 people are killed by law enforcement every single year. Compared to the European Union, United Kingdom, post-Brexit, Australia and New Zealand, 100 approximately are killed every year. And that population is almost 3 times the population of the United States. So there's a systemic problem that we're dealing with. And some people, as opposed to addressing that problem, especially in the aftermath of the kind of uprising you've seen in following the killing of George Floyd, they exploit that to advance their political agenda. And you saw that in the 60s with the law and order agenda that many politicians presented in the face of those deep societal problems. And you see that now in the fact that many politicians, in fact, an entire political party, using this tragic event to push an agenda as opposed to coming together, leading this country down the path of healing and reconciliation.
Thank you. Reverend Dr. Harris, what do you think? More differences or more similarities? Feel free to.
I would say that there's a great deal of continuity between, with the movements. I would suggest that they have not, the movement has not really fully died, right? There's always been, a remnant of folk and people who were pushing for, the dismantling of white supremacy and the dismantling of structural systemic oppression. And so what I do think is different, what I do think is unique to this time, is that this movement is not necessarily, there's no real centralized leadership, that this is coming from many places and every place at the same time. Whereas you could say in the 60s civil rights movement, even though, that the church at least was the, that they were the spokespeople for the movement. And while while there were certainly people from all different backgrounds, faiths and no faiths, who were just as present and involved and participated in the 60s civil rights movement. I think this time there's some pushback and some calling the church to repent from the protesters and from those who are, and not just the church, but religious institutions to also repent. For instance, the Black Lives Matter, part of their platform is inclusion, radical inclusion. It's something that many of our faith houses of worship and our faith communities are not necessarily fully comfortable with. And so in some ways there's a much more grassroots leadership and grassroots kind of ethos to the work. And while the 60s civil rights movement seemed, more grassroots, I think it was much more, it had more planning, or not planning, but there was more strategy around who was going to be the spokespeople, who would be the people out front to be the public face of it, I should say. And I think that the other thing I think is different about this is that what is being asked for here, or what is being demanded by this movement, is full and complete dismantling of systemic structural oppression and racism, the dismantling of white supremacy, so that there is a dissatisfaction with tinkering around the edges and around the margins of reform, but looking for full and complete transformation. Recognizing that it won't come overnight, but that there's no satisfaction with small concessions. That what is being asked, what is being called for, and what is being demanded is full and complete transformation toward a community and towards a system and a nation that actually respects and embeds equity in its system. And I think that's, while obviously the 60s civil rights movement was cut off and stunted by the deaths of many of the leaderships, the killing, the murder of many of the in leadership. I think that there is this difference, that there is an unwillingness to accept small reform or small steps, that there is a recognition that it's time for a full and complete reckoning by this nation and of the world, really, to the systemic nature of oppression.
Thank you. Pastor Barber, what do you think about that? Do you think that, is there more truth to the incremental approach of the 60s versus perhaps what we're seeing today, where we're looking for some change, basically exactly what Reverend Dr. Harris is describing, where we need to keep applying tremendous amounts of pressure to make perhaps what could be described as a long overdue change happen? What are your thoughts? What strategy do you think is more useful? Or
yeah, well, I think what we're experiencing now is in many ways very similar to what was going on in the 60s. It's a mixed bag, okay? As we are moving toward change, as we want change in our society, it is human nature, I think, to want it quickly. I mean, most of the things that we want to make our lives better, we want it now. And just as history tells us in the 60s, it was not all camaraderie in the movement for civil rights. I mean, there were different factions that were applying pressure in different ways change. And there was the peace, peace without any compromise on the way the message was being presented and demanded. The demands were being asked for. And then there was the other side where it was at all costs, whether it was violence or whatever we needed to do in order to get the attention of what was then the establishment. Those were the opposing forces on the same side of the ultimate issue, right? That's not so different from what we're dealing with now. All right. There are plenty of opportunities to see the parallels between those who want incremental change now and those who were in favor of incremental change during the birth of the civil rights movement in the late 50s, early 60s, and so forth and so on. I do think, though, that the energy that exists in our struggle now is just as powerful as the energy and momentum of the 60s. Therefore, that similarity sets us up for moments of success like what we saw in the 60s. Without a shadow of a doubt, the civil rights movement through the 60s achieved great things, all right? But that's in hindsight in many ways, right? Those who were involved in the struggle at the moment might have said that it wasn't so much so. I don't think it will be that different now. I think right now in this struggle, and I will agree with Dr. Faith on the fact that there is very little centralized leadership within the movement or within the groups that are seeking to propel the movement in this age. That I would like to bring to attention is a detriment. The fact that there is a lack of centralized leadership that is recognized by all of those involved sets us up for the possibility that this moment in time could possibly be an event versus a movement. Movements continue when there is structure around the objectives. And when we do not have that structure or that common message that holds everybody together, that gives the opposition to the movement the opportunity to control the narrative. And so we pivot from talking about the rights of citizens and human beings. We pivot from the fact that now we have a multicultural movement that says, I want to see change, not just for myself, but I want to see it for people who don't look like me. We have a moment in time where there is a pivot by those who are trying to control the narrative to turn this into something about symbols and something about the nostalgia of holding on to monuments and so forth and so on. So we have to be very, very, very careful that we do not miss the forest for the trees. But back to your original question, do I see a pushback on incremental change? Of course, because people are tired of being sick and tired. And when we get into that place, you said something early in the introduction where you have all of these emotions that are boiling over. You don't know whether you should be angry or be sad or be, it's all of those emotions that America is feeling right now. And Black America, not only are we feeling it, but it has boiled over, and now it's manifesting itself in some ways that that folks are, how can I say, where folks are just waiting for someone to take the reins and harness the energy to move it into something that will sustain itself.
Yeah, can I quickly add something to that?
Please, Imam.
I think while agreeing on the apparent lack of any centralized leadership, I think as compared to the 60s, there has been the centering of the radical voice. So the movement in the 60s, the radical voice might have been more marginal to the movement of Dr. King and others. Whereas now, the radical voice has become central. And that's the voice that we hear primarily addressing the establishment. And I think that is a major difference.
And I would just like to add that I think, one of the thoughts that I had there related to which I, in some ways, would disagree with Pastor Barber on, that in fact, not having identified leadership in some ways has its benefits. In that what happened to the 60s, in the 60s, when leadership was able to be identified, they were also able to be targeted and killed and removed, which created chaos. And I think that the reality that there is, in some ways, this is going to be a terrible metaphor, so please forgive. But the idea of, some of these zombie movies, that you may be able to, cut off the head, or just to, stop this group from coming, but there's always more coming. And so I think in some ways there's potential for that to be a good thing if there's some, again, some structural a narrative about and there's some agreement on the narrative. And I think that, to me, is the more important issue here. That we have a narrative that centers on the dismantling of the roots of oppression and the roots of white supremacy in our world, not just in our country, but in our world. And I think that is a good starting place and a place where people can do this work and not be necessarily targeted and picked off by those who would want to see the silenced.
I totally agree with that. I think that is a very good point, Dr. Faith. That is the fact that the narrative needs to be clear in the conversation as we see this movement develop. I would say, though, that from the standpoint of the targeting of those that would be in the centralized leadership, I really believe that in the masses in the 60s, that there was that feeling of if I go, there will be others that will come, and I think that is still a common thread even now, because I believe we're seeing that even in its fledgling moments with those that are in this movement. They're not really concerned about their own safety. They're not really concerned about their own well-being, if you will, from a selfish point of view. I think that they are saying, you know what, if this is what it takes for me to see change, and not just change for me, I'm impressed and I'm thrilled to see the number of parents that are involved to say, I'm willing to march because I have children. I'm willing to be there because there are generations yet to be born. And if something happens to me, others will come. But I do agree with you. I do agree with you that there must be a framing of the narrative in order for the narrative to continue to ring true. Otherwise, it's going to get muddled.
Fantastic. Thank you, Pastor Barber. I just want to hearken on one thing that you mentioned in your remarks earlier, which was, how can we make sure that this is a movement and not an event? And that requires some form of infrastructure. And oftentimes, we have some of the top faith leaders in the country on this Zoom today. So I think faith has a tremendous role. The churches and mosques, I think, should play a role in this. And I can share my experience as a Muslim and how I view this. And I would love to get Imam Zaid's feedback initially. The Prophet Muhammad, in his last sermon, said that non-Arab and Arab, there is no superiority over one or the other. Also, a white has no superiority over a black, nor a black has any superiority over a white, except by piety and good action. But in that same prophet's lifetime, you have a situation where two of his close friends and companions, they get into an argument where one of the guys says to the other, to Bilal, who's well known, says, "You're the son of a black woman." And it's meant as an insult. And Bilal goes to the Prophet Muhammad and he tells the other gentleman, you have traces of ignorance in you. So do you see, Imam Zaid, especially in our tradition, especially here in the US, where the majority of Muslims are immigrants, oftentimes they don't see the African American Muslims' contributions?
You know, I think, I don't know, I can be corrected. I don't know if this is an authentic anecdote properly attributed to Jesus, but in our Muslim, we have a lot of Muslim stories dealing with Isa or Jesus, peace be upon him. But there's a saying where Jesus was walking with a group of his disciples and they passed a decaying sheep carcass. And one of the disciples looked at it and he said, "Oh, the stench is overbearing, overwhelming." And one looked and said, "Look how mangy his fur is covered with maggots." And they were going on in that vein. And then Jesus looked at it. He said, "Look how white his teeth are." He said, "I've conditioned my tongue to find good, something good in every situation." So there definitely, as in any community, you have people who do have the vestiges of this ignorance. Then they haven't fully assimilated the teachings of the religion, as in the anecdote you mentioned. And I think it would be well for you to just finish that. So after the Prophet told this, Abi Dhar, peace be upon him, may Allah God be pleased with him, that you have this ignorance in you that hasn't been cultured by the religious teachings. He put his head on the ground and he asked Bilal to step on his face, just out of recognition of the gravity of his transgression. And so we can point out this or that incident, but I prefer to look at the wonderful ways that many members of our community, and there's a long way to go for most, but many have shown so much goodwill. And I'll give a few concrete examples. Since the killing of George Floyd, the Zakat Foundation, which is primarily an immigrant organization, this past weekend distributed 35,000 pounds of fresh produce in Oakland, California, which is predominantly, to use the current phraseology, black and brown city. 35,000 pounds of fresh produce. One of our community members, African-American Muslim, Amari Gray, father of 9 children, was in a head-on collision with a truck. And someone started a launch good campaign for the benefit of Reverend Dr. Harris and Pastor Barber. That's a Muslim crowdfunding site. Over $1 million was raised for that family in 48 hours.
Wow.
And the overwhelming majority of that came from so-called immigrant communities. And so there are definitely things we can point out. We had in Oakland, California, a program where the predominantly immigrants, suburban communities, specifically San Ramon and Pleasanton, MCC, SRVIC, and the inner city, primarily African-American mosque in Oakland, the Lighthouse Mosque, were doing a Zakat program. Zakat is our alms, tithes, if you will. And in 3 or 4 years, we distributed almost $500,000 in Oakland amongst poor Muslims and poor residents of that community. And so there definitely is a way to go, but I would prefer to point out the positive things that are happening, and then let's build on that, because we have enough negativity in the world. And people don't generally join movements when you tell them how bad they are. So, you know, try to be positive, fully acknowledging that indeed there are horror stories, and those need to be eliminated, and we need to work to eliminate those. But there are so many points of light, and as this darkness, if anyone, despite this movement, this uprising, despite the changes that we see, with the departments eliminating plainclothes divisions and demilitarizing and making commitments, despite all of that, I think we can, especially people of faith, can see a lot of darkness descending over this land. And as people of faith, one of the things we need is to generate as much light as we can to repulse that darkness.
Wow, that is powerful. Thank you. Thank you. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to jump in, Zaid, but I'm done.
Go ahead.
I have to go ahead and jump in on that one, because my brother has really said something that touched my heart. Because one of the struggles of, I will say, the faith community as a whole is to be able to engage the hearts of men and women at its core. Why? Because we have become less relevant in their day-to-day lives. What Imam has just described is the institution becoming a part of people's needs, taking care of the needs of the communities, feeding people, bridging gaps and bandaging their emotional wounds when they've been broken, and backing all of that up with real material substance. That is important. There should be a boldness about people of faith, I think, and not out of arrogance, but for me as a Protestant Christian to say, look, in New Testament teaching, those who followed Christ were those who were bold. Even when they stood in front of authority, they were bold, not out of their own strength, but because of what they believed, because of their faith in their leader, who was and is Jesus Christ. I have to say that we have abdicated in many ways the voice to reach our people in the various communities of faith, because we allow others to dominate the narrative. We allow political institutions to tell the good stories. You know, it is the government that's doing all this wonderful stuff. It's federal and state that controls the happiness or sadness of people. I think that there must be a revival, if you will, within the community of faith that says, no, your faith is still your greatest asset. Your sense of community with your brothers and sisters is still your greatest place of strength and refuge. Look for that. And I think we really do need to sound that horn. And Imam, thank you for that. That is absolutely point on.
I know Reverend Dr. Harris is chomping at the bit, but if I could very quickly, I think also it's important for us, in addition, faith, definitely, we have to, everything we do is built on faith. That's the difference. That's why we are faith-based communities. And we're not something other than that. And that's not to denigrate or dismiss anything other communities might be doing, but what is to use the language of Adam Smith, the economist, he talked about the wealth of nations. What is this nation's comparative advantage? And so as a faith community in this struggle, what is our comparative advantage? What can we do better than anyone else? And I think the language of faith becomes very important here. Of course, we have to have the language of civil rights, human rights, but we also need the language of faith. Otherwise, an essential aspect of our message will be lost. Because, listen, after the statues come down, after the reforms are engaged in or not engaged in, this country is going to be more divided than it ever has been since the Civil War. And if you don't have a party out there who can speak the language of love and the language of hope, it's going to be a hot time in the old town. And how messages can get distorted. I was thinking of Marx. That's a great way to interject. into a faith-based conversation. But there are those who distort what Marx said. They say, oh, Karl Marx said religion is the opiate of the people. And in other words, religion puts people to sleep, and it moves them away from the concerns of the people. It leads them to pie in the sky and the by and by. But Marx was misquoted, and that's why narrative is so important. The full statement is religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature. It is the heart of a heartless world, the soul of soulless conditions. It is the opiate of the masses. And so in other words, when these heartless conditions become even more heartless, who is going to step forward to maintain people's heart? When the soulless conditions become more soulless, who's going to put a message out there that can revive people's souls and give them, renew their faith, not only in God, but in each other as communities? And so this is the comparative advantage of religion. And as we do the work that my esteemed fellow panelists have dedicated their lives to, we have to also do that work and not let that work be lost as we go forward.
Reverend Dr. Harris.
I am chomping at the bit. I would say I agree with most of what my two brothers have already stated, and I would add that for me, certainly faith is the beginning of has been the beginning of wisdom, and it is the place where I start and end my work, and I hope my journey in life, and so that my goal, my hope, my work is centered on trying to change the hearts and minds of people. That goes back to that narrative again. I'm 100% behind the most radical argument of the protesters in the street. Why? Because even whether they're doing it from a perspective, because of their doctrine or because of their faith tradition, what they're ultimately arguing for and demanding is this idea of radical inclusion of all life on this planet. And I think not just human life, but also, because I am a bit of an environmentalist, so it isn't just about human life. It's about calling humanity back to a place, not necessarily back to a place, but calling humanity to a place where we actually understand this world to be not just for our personal, not just for our personal pocketbook, for our own developing of wealth and power and authority over others and over the animal kingdom, but it is actually that we be able to live in some manner of harmony where everyone is able to, everyone and every entity created on this earth has the opportunity to live out its full being, to be able to express its full self. And for me, that starts with my faith. But I also understand that, and if I'm honest and fair and truthful, that our faith traditions have sometimes gotten in the way of that, which is why we can say, we're saying, to some, it is a critique that the Black Lives Matter movement and many of these movements are not connected to a particular faith tradition. Well, they're not, because they are unwilling to, because they're calling in some ways faith traditions to a more radical transformation of even our faith traditions. And so it's an opportunity for us to rethink and to reflect on what it is we have misinterpreted about our faith, right? That has made it possible for this kind of structural, systemic, ideological, insidious kind of thinking that would create a white supremacy and make it in many ways a doctrine of a religion. right? And so, yes, I want to focus on what is beautiful and good about our faith traditions and what we do well. We have great theology. I mean, that's not the problem. It's it's that we don't live into into that theology. We had a conversation with a rabbi and her Nessa Muslim sister, and an Episcopal bishop, and when we talk about our faith traditions and what our faith traditions, the philosophy and the beliefs and the teachings. I mean, if we could just live there, that we wouldn't have this problem. The problem is we don't live into those faith traditions, and so it's a changing of our hearts and minds, and it's a changing of the narrative that created this current situation. And faith traditions have a great deal of work to do, responsibility, but they also have a great deal to offer. And so I'm hopeful, as well as frustrated, as well as angry, as well as all of the emotions that you described in the beginning. But it is my faith that keeps me going, that makes me energized and inspired to get up and to pray for those young people and old people and children and 60s civil rights people that who have been re-energized again and are out protesting with people now, with this generation's movement. And so I agree 100%. We have to do better. We have to do more. We have to dig deeper, and certainly the ultimate goal is the idea of this radical sense of inclusion and equity, where all of God's children, all of God's creation is able to live in harmony, and no one is left out, put down, based on color, based on what kind of creation they are, that all are able to express fully who they are in this beautiful, glorious world we have.
Thank you, Reverend. So this has been an eye-opening conversation for me. I've really appreciated your perspective, your open-minded perspective. I've appreciated Imam Zaid's optimism and Pastor Barber's friendship and allyship. I want to finish on time, but also I would love to get your last thoughts. So if everyone can just share their last thoughts with the audience in 1 minute. We'll start with Pastor Bo. Go ahead.
Thank you. Well, I want to leave with everyone that simply because there is so much to do, simply because the playing field is so broad, that is not an excuse to do nothing. So in other words, the fact that the work is great, that we have so many to help, that there are so many issues to address, that there are so many places that we have to go. Do not be discouraged, but be steadfast in that. Whatever small difference that can be made in your space, make that difference. Be determined, persevere. It is, I like what Dr. Faith said about the conviction. I'm paraphrasing, I'm putting in my own word. There is a conviction of what we call our faith community, because we have not always been in place when those who were in need needed us. So therefore, be encouraged. Go outside your walls, go outside your comfort zone, and do not be afraid to speak to power. I will quickly use this piece out of Acts in the 4th chapter, where Peter had to stand before those who were in power. Do not be afraid, but be emboldened, and even expect the fact that you will be challenged again and again to step back and to stop your message. But continue the message that all people, regardless of where we come from, regardless of the color of our skin, regardless of what we identify as our faith wall, that all people have a right to live, and to live a life that has dignity and that has honor.
Thank you so much. Dr. Harris.
I would just say that in many ways, to echo what Pastor Barber said, I think that participating at your level of gift, your level of ability, your level of time, whatever is in your hand, use that for the good. Pray, serve, give, learn, utmost learn, and be present. Do not absent yourself from the journey and from the fight, from the struggle.
Thank you. Imam Zaid?
Yeah, Bismillah. I think it's very important for us to remind each other and remind all of those folks who are out there working, struggling, striving to affect positive change in our society, that the race to justice is a marathon and not a sprint. It's a long race. Take time to grab the water bottles people offer you. If you feel the cramp coming on, pull over to the side and massage the cramp. And so as you run the race, find joy. Cultivate inner peace. Find the ability to reach out and love others. Otherwise, we won't make it to the finish line. And so it's a long, long race. And as Dr. King said, the moral arc of the universe, we're talking about this country immediately, or this world, the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. So it's a long race. And get a nice pace, don't burn yourself out, and enjoy the scenery, and keep moving. And thank you for the opportunity, Shahid, and your team.
It's a pleasure. We really appreciate you, Imam Zaid, Reverend Dr. Harris, and Pastor Barber. I'd like to thank all of you from the bottom of my heart, and I'd also like to thank the audience on behalf of American Muslim Institution. We look forward to putting these types of programs together to build bridges in our community, and now more than ever, that's really important. If anyone has missed this presentation, it'll be on our YouTube channel at American Muslim Institution, or you can find it on our Facebook page, American Muslim Institution. Make sure you like and share. Thank you all, and have a good night. Assalamu alaikum.
Have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you. What an honor. Thank you.
I've been tremendously honored, and hopefully we can stay in conversation.
That would be great.
I would love
Translate
that.
some of that into action.
Absolutely
Join
love
Join
that.
that collective action.
I'll connect you all via email.
Please.
Take care, guys. Good night.
Good night.